Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spirit and Place event presented by Can Cinema and the Indianapolis Film Project. I am Louise Henderson. I am the Executive Director of the Indianapolis Film Project, which is the not-for-profit organization that powers the Can Cinema, which is a 3-screen state-of-the-art theater in the Near East Side neighborhood of Windsor Park that was due to open in March 2020. We have operated since then as a virtual theater, as well as doing some selected outdoor screenings. And we are really thrilled to still be able to present this event, even though we had hoped to do it live and in person at our theater next year. We will do that. Before we go any further, I am going to share with you a video from Spirit and Place, just to sort of welcome all of you and put things within the context of the greater festival.
Welcome to the 25th Annual Spirit and Place Festival, the nation's only arts, humanities, and religion festival. My name is Erin Kelly, and I'm the Program Director for Spirit and Place. We know this year's festival is different than other years, but you're here, we're here, and that's what matters. We'd like to begin this festival with a new practice. That is acknowledging that we are standing on the traditional homelands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and others, people who were unjustly removed from this land. Our origin story as a community begins with them. We also want to thank our sponsors who helped make the festival possible: Lilly Endowment Incorporated, Allen Whitehill Clues, Bolson Group, the Indianapolis Foundation, a CICF affiliate, and the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. We hope you enjoy the variety of events exploring this year's Origins theme. You can learn more about all of the festival events by going to spiritandplace.org. By going to the website, you can also read our community agreements. And these are agreements that we hope you will use to help structure a respectful and mindful festival experience. By visiting our website, spiritandplace.org, you can also take an online survey and tell us what you thought about the event you attended. We rely on this feedback to guide our work and strongly encourage you to go to spiritandplace.org to tell us about your experience. Thank you for supporting Spirit and Place, and have a wonderful festival.
Thank you, Erin Kelly. She is wonderful, and we're grateful to have her share that. A couple housekeeping things. This is a webinar, so the only faces on screen are those of our panelists and myself. We do welcome your input, however. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function, and I encourage you to put any questions or thoughts that you have in the chat function. We'll monitor that. And if you, I'm going to ask Annie to please maybe post that video, or that video of the from Spirit and Place in the chat, because I think not everyone could hear it. So in addition, we aim to be accessible for people as best we can. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the bar, and there is a closed caption option. If you just click on that, that will turn on closed captioning for you during this conversation. For those with low vision, I and my guests will all try to briefly visually describe ourselves so that you can tell us all apart. I am Louise, the moderator. I've got dark curly shoulder length hair, and I'm wearing glasses. So when our panelists introduce themselves, I'll ask them to do the same. If you have any problems, please just do put something in the chat. The Indianapolis Film Project, of which I am the executive director, was founded to fill a hole in our city's cultural canvas. Our mission is to enrich the culture of our city through film education, community engagement, and to bring independently produced film to our city, which is currently not done. Many films bypass our city. We have big ambitions, and our first project, that the Can Cinema, which I mentioned earlier, a 3-screen state-of-the-art theater in the Near East Side neighborhood of Windsor Park, was all ready to open in March, and we will do so sometime in 2021. In the meantime, we're virtual. Film is a powerful storytelling tool. It's also an incredible archive, visual archive of our lives, our origins. The film, These Amazing Shadows, which was made in 2011, which I hope all of you watched before this event, introduces us to the National Film Registry. Founded in 1988 by an act of Congress, the registry annually inducts 25 films each year that its board has established as being culturally, historically or aesthetically significant, or all of the above. While the films must be 10 years old before they can be considered, anything on film can be considered. So Hollywood films, documentary films, feature-length, shorts, home videos, experimental films, music videos, industrial and educational films, in short, films of all kinds. I'm not talking about films that won the Academy Award. As one subject in the film says, the Academy Awards preserves the consensus of the time, but very often history proves them wrong. If you want to learn more about the National Film Registry, check out its website, which we will post in the chat for all of you to check out. It's quite interesting. You can see all of the films that have been inducted since its founding, and films that were nominated but not inducted, et cetera, et cetera. And they do accept public nominations. So if you're passionate, go ahead and nominate a film. In the early days of film, early in the 20th century, film was a force for shaping a common sense of American culture. We weren't connected to each other as we are today, and movies helped create a sense of nationhood in all of our diversity. This living audiovisual history is a document of our culture, our origins. It's our national film album. Just as we save family photos, so too should we save the films that document American life and American heritage. It's the only way to recreate the experience of something that has happened and is past, to see it visually and to better understand the origin of who we are as a nation, as a society. Film, as Roger Ebert famously said, is an empathy machine, a way to, by seeing something through another's lens, understand and see what we might otherwise never know because it's outside of our own experience. To create a storehouse of films deemed important enough to preserve, it will now and in the future allow one era to talk to another era, an accessible time capsule. Our panelists tonight come from the world of film, both in the making and the preserving and the archiving of it. My interest in this topic is not to specifically stick to the topics of the film, but to use it as a jumping off point to talk about the role of film, to tell stories of all kinds. How, while Hollywood has largely shown a largely white male view of the world, there has simultaneously always been films created to tell the stories of those outside that mainstream. Further, what can we learn from amateur videos that are a window to the offbeat, the personal, and those on the edges of a culture? Films that had a purely utilitarian purpose can tell us volumes about who we were and are as a society. And in the current day, what is it like to tell the stories of people and communities whose stories for too long have been overlooked? So with that, I would love to introduce our panel. I'd like to start with Jordan Ryan. Jordan is an architectural historian, archivist, and activist scholar. Jordan most recently managed the Indianapolis Bicentennial Collecting Initiative and curated the Bicentennial exhibit for the Indiana Historical Society. They have a master's degree in public history from IUPUI and a bachelor's degree in art history from the Herron School of Art and Design. Jordan's scholarship revolves around the built environment, urban planning, historic preservation, marginalized communities, hostile architecture, and LGBTQ historic sites. Such a fascinating compendium of things. Rachael Stoeltje established the Indiana University Library's Moving Image Archive in 2010 and has served as its director since its founding. She's served on the International Federation of Film Archives Executive Committee since 2013 and was the chair of the Coordinating Council of Audiovisual Archives Associations for the 2018-19 term. For 2 decades, Rachael has worked to preserve, archive, and provide access to vast and varied film, photography, and personal collections. She also writes about film. She has co-created a global training and outreach program and has planned and managed IU's mass film digitization project. Jerald Harkness has over 25 years of documentary production experience. His first film, Steppin', launched his career, garnering him many awards and put him on the radar as an up-and-coming filmmaker. He has not stopped since. Jerald has produced and directed documentary films for broadcast and the big screen, including The Game of Change, Facing the Facade, the docudrama series True First, and much, much more. He's produced and directed films for Paramount TV, the Urban Movie Channel, ESPN, VH1, A&E, PBS, and the NCAA, earning accolades and awards along the way, including a national Emmy. Jerald is a native of Indianapolis and thankfully for us still calls it home. He is a board member of the Indianapolis Film Project, and I have to say his support of our work so far has been invaluable. He has many projects on his docket this year, and we're grateful to have him and Rachel and Jordan with us tonight. So from here, I'm going to move on and ask each of you to sort of take that and then go further and tell us a little bit more about the work that you do in your respective fields. So let's start with Jordan.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. So a little bit about the Indiana Historical Society, where I'm currently employed. Established in 1830, the Historical Society is a private nonprofit. They really started as an archive, first and foremost, and now it is a museum that publishes books and provides all sorts of programming and outreach. But I think the archive is a really magical place because it's one of the oldest archives we have in the state. They started collecting historical documents about the history of Indiana and the Northwest Territory. And most of these documents are going to be two-dimensional. It's not a place of artifacts. It's a place that collects sort of manuscript materials. So when you think of things like letters and important papers, but also visuals, so historic, photographs and maps and blueprints and all sorts of magical things. And they really started with sort of individual papers and family papers and businesses and institutional, a lot of transportation and military and architectural materials. But what I've noticed over the last few decades in particular, there's a huge push for more moving image content. So as part of managing the architectural archive there, I spend a lot of time sort of playing with drawings and blueprints and building specs, photo documentation, planning and policy kind of materials, lots of maps. But there's definitely more sort of visual moving image and film documentation that architects and developers, site planners, people involved with redevelopment of large sites, you start to see more and more of that. Overall, at the Historical Society, there's thousands and thousands of historic moving image items, mostly 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter, but we're getting into more modern moving image kind of formats. Of course, there's piles of VHS tapes and U-matics, and now we're getting into all the digital formats and DVDs, and that's sort of an exciting place to be. But for me, my research is really at sort of the intersection of the built environment. And when I say built environment, I mean like architecture and infrastructure and sort of the city and urban planning side of that, and thinking about how all these different, trivial or significant policies and choices that were made 50, 100 years ago, they all impact us today, sort of how we function in the built environment. So that's where a lot of my research is going. And then I'll end there. And my physical description, I'm a younger-ish woman presenting person, lots of bangs and big eyebrows. How's that?
Rachel.
Okay. First, thanks so much for having us. And I'm so sorry that we couldn't all be there together to be doing this. So Jordan, following Jordan's description, I'll forget to do this otherwise. I'm an older-ish person with dark hair, quickly graying, with glasses. So I'm so thrilled to be here to talk to y'all and to have a conversation, really. And I love that Louise brought this into this idea of the National Family Album. I think the film itself, if y'all were able to watch it, really just encompasses sort of the state of film preservation today, and everything that I have done both locally here but also internationally. So if we think about all of our cultural heritages, so we're talking, that film really talks about the US particularly, but if you also think about what cultural heritages aren't being preserved, really, and expand that notion and think about non-Western cultures who don't have the resources. It's pretty phenomenal how much material has been lost. Of course, that the film points out those early years from 1895 up through the 30s, really, or the 20s, really how much silence has been lost. But also, if you just think about like the home movies, right? We were talking the other day when we were planning this, that home movies have so much rich information about our history and our culture. So how the film plays into, and this topic plays into what we do here, here at the IU Library's Moving Image Archive. We started an archive with the core collection being sort of documentary educational films that IU distributed around the country from the 20s through the 1990s. So not that sort of Hollywood productions, really, right? And I think the film showed this a lot, that we've really started to shift to recognizing that the amateur films, the sponsored films, the educational films are so valuable. Our personal story connected to the National Film Registry is the Edward and Naomi File film, The Inner World of Aphasia, which was made as a medical film, was nominated to the registry in, I want to say 2016, and I've lost the date exactly. It's a 1968 film. That led to a faculty member at New York University sort of connecting us with the File family, getting their entire collection, which we've now preserved and restored that film. I think that film in particular is sort of unique at a lot of different levels, but you wouldn't necessarily think of a medical training film being on the National Film Registry, which is what I think is so interesting, at least in the last 10 years, and really looking at those titles and expanding our notion of what is being documented and what's being preserved, which is really the core of what we do: preservation, restoration, and providing access to our cultural memories. So.
Yeah, I look forward to getting into that more. Jerald Harkness.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jerald Harkness. Male, bald, orange shirt, Capricorn. Hopefully that's good enough of a description for everybody. But hey, thanks to Can. Thank you, Louise. It's great to see Rachel again, and Jordan. It's been a pleasure meeting you. This has been a lot of fun. I'm not as interesting as the distinguished guest. You know, I'm an independent documentary producer and director. Like Louise said, I've been doing it for 25 years. But in watching the movie, I really felt a connection to the message of the movie, and that, you know, the movie tries to talks about the National Film Registry, how it recognizes movies and works that are culturally and aesthetically impactful for a certain time and period. And being a documentary producer and director, you know, I hadn't really thought about it, but I think that has been the goal of my career. I've always tried to tell the stories that might not necessarily become a Hollywood or a cable produced project. But it was really interesting to see the movies that they recognize, the ones that you have to have, like Citizen Kane and Gone with the Wind and things of that nature. But then they have like commercials and training videos, as Rachel mentioned, and just such an eclectic group of films that they selected. So at any rate, that, you know, I think that's just always been my goal, is to try to tell the stories that usually don't get told. And it's just always fighting that balance of a production is a business. You know, you have to make sure that you have a budget and that you produce it up within that budget, and hopefully it reaches the widest audience possible. But also that battle between budget and also trying to stay as close to your message and what you're trying to communicate with your crew as possible. And so I really enjoyed the movie. Thanks, Louise, for bringing it to my attention. I'm a list guy anyway. I always love the debate. You know, Michael Jordan, LeBron, who's the greatest actor, Marlon Brando, Meryl Streep. And so, you know, if anyone wants to throw that debate in there, I always love those type of debates as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Jerald. And and maybe I'm typecasting, but it feels like it is. As a woman, I don't find list making to be as important, but I find that a lot of the men in my life are, and maybe I'm completely gender stereotyping there, but it is funny when you mentioned lists. So I'll also note that Rachel and Jerald were classmates at IU. So I was really, it was a pleasant and happy accident that they were, John Vickers, who's also on our board, recommended Rachel, and Jerald lit up saying, well, that will be great. So, and then Jordan, especially with the work on the bicentennial thing is definitely someone we wanted to include. So, speak to me more. Well, actually, I'm going to kick off with something that Jerald actually sent me this morning. Given the events of the weekend, it made him think about how film captures stories and experiences in a certain point in time. And in the wake of the 2016 election, Jerald was asked to contribute a short film to a collection of shorts that talked about how the 2016 presidential election affected students around the country. Jerald did a short about a student in Nashville, Tennessee, who is a Republican and from a fairly Christian conservative family, but he's at a large, very diverse public high school. We're going to put the link to it in the Vimeo. The Vimeo link in the chat, and I urge you to watch it. It's just 8 minutes, and I did not know where it was going. It has a really interesting arc to it. So kudos to you, Jerald. But I think that's what film can do. It can capture that moment, and after it's gone, it's gone. So if we don't preserve it, then it's gone. So with that, Rachel or Jordan, I don't know if one of you wants to speak to that about how the work that you're doing, the things that you're seeing. So you're seeing primarily non-professionally produced film, and sort of what it is telling, what's the value of what it has to tell us about the moment in time that it's portraying.
Again, I'm going to start, and Rachel can clean up this mess. I tell people, like, history is being made right now, and it's really hard for us to sort of separate ourselves from it, because you think like it always happened like before you were born, and I always have to kind of get people excited and be like the cheerleader, like, no, this moment that happened last week, this moment that happened on Saturday, we're going to remember that for the rest of our lives. So it's funny working on the bicentennial and thinking about all of these huge transitions and moments that happen in the city's history, particularly in the last 40 years. It's sort of a void in the archive because no one was thinking about collecting that stuff because it's not history. So getting people excited about their different collections in their garages and their attics, what have you, and being like, no, I want that stuff. Like, that's what we need to be telling, because I'm not being a good archivist if I'm not collecting the stuff where we have gaps, because in 50 years, in 100 years, whatever, there's going to be a researcher who wants to know about Unigov or wants to know what turn of the century, what was 2000 like in Indianapolis. So it's my job to collect that stuff. But I also think it's, we say like a picture is worth 1,000 words, but like a film is also worth like 1,000 pictures. Like there's sort of this thing where the research value of film is really an exciting thing to me, to be able to identify little glimmers of places and sort of the changing spaces we have of downtown. But that's another tangent. But back to sort of contemporary political history and what Jerald was working on, I think thinking about like COVID and protests over the summer, like that's really relevant to collect now while people are still documenting things, and we can sort of trace, who was taking what photographs, what location were you at, sort of the context of that stuff. So doing different collecting initiatives and just doing outreach with contemporary photographers and videographers sort of in the moment of this, momentous time to be an American and going through all these different things, capturing it now so that we don't get it in 50 years when it's just in boxes and we don't really know the context. That's really important.
Yeah. So is that is that on our radar now for archivists and preservationists to do that, so that are we more aware today of we need to capture this now rather than come across it years from now and then try to put it back into the context in which it was made?
I think so. It really is content based, and then what archive you're at, or what sort of staffing limitations you have. And I'd like to hear from Rachel, like maybe, I feel like Rachel and I are kind of funny in that you're a content master, like you know how to work with film, whereas like I'm like a topic kind of expert. So like I just kind of stumble across film in my sort of topical collections. So I'm interested to hear what Rachel has to say from like a type of material.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to head down one path, but I will just do a big giant shout out to the fact that digital preservation is a huge and scary topic, and that people are capturing things on a format that is so unstable. They think that digitization is permanent and forever and not problematic. And quite honestly, motion picture film is incredibly stable. So you can actually like hold up, actually, of course, have a piece, like you can hold up a piece of film to the light and you know what it is. But what's being captured, or what was being captured on Saturday, while there might have been 7 million phones in, all over the city of Indianapolis, or I don't know, all over the billions and billions of people capturing really fantastic footage. Holding on to born digital material is something that institutions across our country and around the world are just starting to grapple with, and the amount of data and how to store that and how to keep reformatting that, right? Because in 20 years, you're not going to be able to access like one of these, right? So that's a whole nother topic. I think it's really important, but I was going to go back to your original question a little bit, Louise, because you were talking a little bit. A lot of the material I work with here at IU actually was produced. We do have amateur and home movies, but what I find fascinating are the stories. You were talking about the stories it tells, and sometimes the stories that it's telling that we see today aren't what it was meant to be, right? So US government film we have called Supervising Women Workers, which was a training film in the 40s when men went off to war and women came into the workplace. Like the number of classes that resonates with today. There's a film about growing cotton that speaks volumes, right? As these male white fellas are narrating and people are picking cotton in the background. I mean, I have a cataloger who was really upset watching it, and it was just a sort of boring little educational film, right? Another film that I love called They Can't Eat Tobacco was made by these two women who graduated from Wellesley and like took off and started making films in the late 40s about sort of social issues, right? So they're capturing both these amazing visuals, but talking about social, cultural issues that are hard to picture even today, right? So I think my bigger point is just all the information that can be gathered in this visual, amazing context, and the work that Jerald does, right? The people who are capturing this, despite the digital preservation issues and our concern for born digital, it is exactly what Jordan was talking about. This is what future generations are going to look back on and figure out who we were and what the heck we were doing, right? I could talk forever, but I can pause and let other people talk.
No, I'll piggyback with what Rachel just said. And Louise, that was nice of you to share the election effect. And that project has such an interesting backstory, because I was, as Louise knows very well, I was working with the squad. I was working with Susan and Albie, who are Academy Award winning executive producers. So I knew, number one, I had to have my A game right, because they create content at such a high caliber, and they're the best executive producers that I've ever worked with. But all that said, you're going into a situation where I think Jordan said this before when we had the pre-meeting, where I had to capture something in the moment, and I don't really get to have multiple takes or anything like that. And so when you're dealing with, I went to Hume Fogg in Nashville, Tennessee, as you indicated, Louise, to tell the story of a conservative student going to a very diverse, very progressively leaning high school. And the reason why I chose that story is because I know the progressive perspective, right? That's my ideology. I always like to challenge myself to delve into a story where sometimes I don't have that secondhand knowledge, like that natural knowledge of what it means to be a conservative, what it means to be in that type of situation. And I just felt like all the media that I consume is progressively based, and I wanted to tell a story from a conservative's perspective. And I think we all just fell in love with that young man. He was just such a well-read, so articulate, so sensitive, so passionate about politics and ideology, that it was an honor to work on that type of story. And it was important to capture a story about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton from the perspective of young adults. And even though as of this weekend it looks like we're turning the page on that chapter, like Rachel indicated, it was really an honor. It's always an honor and a privilege to tell a story, but that one in particular, I just knew the gravity of it, because it's such a combative, polarizing subject to do with any narrative that deals with Trump or Hillary Clinton. And I don't set out to try to appease the audience, but that one I just wanted to thread the needle and hopefully be true to the story, and at the end of the day capture some sort of empathy, which I think the National Registry, or in your introduction, Louise, you said that film is this wealth of empathy, and that's what I always shoot for with the projects that I do. And so anyway, now I'm rambling, and I should hand the baton to Jordan and Rachel again. So.
Well, I found that interesting, and actually something that in rewatching the film jumped up to me, and that is within your realm, Jerald, of documentary filmmaking, is you're capturing the moment as it happens, whereas something scripted, right? It's scripted, and you're just looking for the best shot. But in your case, the type of documentary filmmaking is you've got to be there and capture that, and then know how to react, right? So what I felt that that film does well, and here I'm speaking to all of you about a film none of you have seen, but it's just giving nuance, right? And I think that's the craft, and that's what we look to preserve is the things that aren't that give the nuance of the time, because we may remember 2016, the presidential election, in very black and white terms, but just as hopefully we'll also have a good archive of the 2020 election, and give it the nuance. I guess that would be my immediate question, or my immediate comment from that,
Yeah. When you're approaching a narrative, and it's a documentary. I am a documentary producer, but I'm more of a non-fictional storyteller, in that I approach it like a scripted project, and I always try to do things in 3 acts. And so I'm not as much cinema verite as maybe some of the films that Rachel and Jordan deal with. But when you're approaching a narrative, it's very much like a jazz musician, in that you want to be as prepared as possible. You want to get the best interviews and know your interview subjects very well. You want to have the aesthetic kind of figured out, but you also have to be reactive, and you have to be impulsive, and you have to be able to be spontaneous, so that if something happens, there were a couple of things that happened at Election Effect that just kind of happened. We're like, whoa, let's hurry up and try to get that. You're always rushing around and trying to find the camera angles and stuff like that. So it's it's always a challenge. You want to be as prepared as possible, but you also have to be flexible to try to capture the moment, as you guys have been mentioning, and try to be true to the moment, true to the narrative. So,
and then it's so fascinating. The reason I wanted to have the sort of the mix of you, Jerald, making things, contemporaneously, and then the two of you, Rachel and Jordan, trying to preserve and archive what has happened is just that, is what we see in, say, Jerald's filmmaking today. And then you've both touched on this, Rachel and Jordan. What else do you see when you're looking at these films years hence? So can you speak to that a little bit more? You both referred a little bit to it, but tell me more some of the things that you've seen or that we're learning from looking at films that are totally opposite what they were intended to be for their original audience.
Well, I think the core part of the collection that I preserve, we could say was made for entirely different audiences, whether they were the social guidance films, right? Like 1952, What to Do on a Date, that's really a film, right? And those were shown in the schools. We have a little series we do where graduate students curate it and we show them in a bar and it's fun and there's bingo, but films like that, people think are hysterical now, but scholars or academics or regular members of the public, I think looking at them, if you actually think about it, it's a little disturbing. But if you look at a collection like ours, so much of the information, so we have a collection of World War II propaganda films made by the US government, right? These were shown to the public to sort of prepare them, to sort of get them to understand what's going on. But there's a title called Japs Know Your Enemy, right? It is so horrific and so appalling. The intention was, the US government to prepare US citizens in a very different aspect. What I like to tell students today who get really upset by the inherent sexism and racism and just ugliness of some of these films is that our history is actually really kind of ugly, and that these are documents of our past, right? So when people get incredibly uncomfortable watching them, I think it's just appropriate to have a conversation about what they're seeing and how this plays into our entire history. But we don't have necessarily a beautiful, pretty history. And I think your initial question of how they were intended, we have a series of films called that were made by the Council of International American Affairs. They were all films shown in other countries about those countries, but not shown within the US. Like the US government made so many amazing films I could talk about forever, obviously. Or IU made some films. IU Goes to War, 1941, right? And getting everybody behind the war effort. Like we would never have anything like that today. But I could talk forever. Somebody asked me what bar. So we show them in the Bishop in Bloomington. And we call it Social Guidance Sunday.
Oh, I love it.
But yeah, so much of what we have, or even if you think about, we have a series, somebody asked about home movies. We have a 2-generational set of home movies that were made by George Holland, who was in Bloomington, and then his daughter also continued the series on. She's now 84. So we have this amazing, from the 30s through the 70s, historic sort of very Bloomington, very white, but also documenting, Jordan was talking about architecture, like Bloomington architecture and what houses go up and down. But how much information home movies captures, I could also go on forever about. But intention of the product, especially if it was a documentary or educational film that were shown in the schools, or to service units or professional training, to how we view them today, especially in an academic community that wants to really focus in on a topic. But seeing undergraduates watch some of these, I think they're just frankly appalled most of the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I mean, it's so important though, right? Because it gives nuance, right? That, oh gosh, this was made then and no one gave a second thought to it. And you're looking at it with these 21st century eyes and you see it so differently. I know the film that we featured in our Spirit and Place event last year was a 1955 or 56 film. And it was the very first film, it starred Betty Davis. It was the very first film that took on the issue of McCarthyism in its story, obviously not directly. And looking at it with 2020 or 2019 eyes was just a very interesting experience, because you saw things in it, both that were of the time, but the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So these films probably show some of the ugliness, but that's still there, you know, as we've discovered. And probably the more aware of it we are, the better. Jordan, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was just thinking about not just intent of like why something was made, but how did they intend on it living? Like, did it have a legacy at all? So I think about the Department of Waterworks collection, which was one of my favorite collections I worked on. What was so neat about it was that it was about 250 35 millimeter films from the Indianapolis Waterworks Department from the 1930s to about the 1950s. And they were documenting this stuff for like legal and like insurance purposes. Like it was just going to live in their office. Like I don't think there was ever an intention for a lot of, like, I don't think anyone saw like a scholarly value or a research value to it. But it's one of the coolest collections, and I'll drop the link in the chat unless Evan already did, because he's a big fan of this collection. It's showing like aerial shots of downtown, of, you know, suburbanization, of reservoirs getting created, of areas that were once rural, like 62nd and Keystone, that is now like, you know, super built up, goofy commercials and events with politicians, you know, we'd all recognize. And I think it's really interesting from like a land use perspective, an architectural history perspective, in historic preservation, when you see these fleeting moments of buildings, you know, right before they're demolished for a parking lot or right before they're restored. But I get a lot out of these videos because, you know, you can sort of get a sense of density and massing and sort of space from a fire insurance map, like a historic Sanborn map or historic base map. Even an aerial photograph will give you a sense of that. But having the film, having that moving image just gives you so much more like data to sort of understand space. So I think that collection, you know, advocating to get it digitized for the bicentennial, I think will be one of the most useful things for scholars focusing on Indianapolis history. But the other collection I wanted to talk about was the Indy Pride, Chris Gonzalez, Michael Bohr LGBTQ collection, which is about, I want to say 300 films. A lot of it is VHS, some DVDs in there, but most of that content was essentially, think of like a home movie. It's mostly drag show performances in the 1970s and 1980s. And it was just a couple, Bob and Margaret Green, who were huge drag show enthusiasts in town. And they just obsessively documented all of these performances. It's incredibly diverse. Like we tend to think of, you know, drag performances being mostly white cis gay men, but it's incredibly racially diverse. You're getting a sense of all the locations where they're performing. You're getting a sense of the fashion, of music style. And then there's also like this very tragic narrative of watching performers from the 70s start to disappear in the 1980s and sort of the AIDS crisis. And I don't think that they ever intended on this stuff being an archive, but it is. And it's one of the most incredible collections that I can't wait to really do a deep dive into.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned the waterworks thing. And when we were talking about earlier, you mentioned the environmental justice that or injustice that was so apparent. And again, not at all what they were planning. They were just documenting it. But looking at it today, you could see how just the institutionalized racism of the era preferenced peoples and societies and neighborhoods, right?
A lot of pollution around White River and who lives in floodplains, and we're living with that legacy, you know, 100, 120 years later. And there's certainly environmental injustice to what neighborhoods are by, different industry and sort of toxic brownfields and things like that. And the water company knew what, they knew, and they were documenting those things. And now we can kind of use that today to fight for a more equitable sort of land use policy.
Right. They knew, but they didn't, it didn't matter, right? Because it was just, that's just the way of the world. So, thank God. Rachel, I'm curious to know, what was the reason that the moving picture, that your organization was founded? Can you speak to that? Like why it came into being?
Yeah, so we had about all the motion picture films on State Film that were on the campus were stored in a bowling alley off-site. When I was brought in, and I had worked a little bit with some of the collections, so this includes the educational collection, the Kinsey Institute's collection, the Lilly Library, the Black Film Center Archive, and the University Archive. So, and nobody had, they just kind of shifted them off, and people who don't have expertise in motion picture film, it's a challenge for sure to deal with. I can show you what it looked like. There. So that was the bowling alley when I came on board. So I was hired and I was given the first year to move this collection out, and we moved it to that. Woo! But basically, the libraries took on a lot of these collections and realized the importance of dealing with them. We formed an archive the second year. We moved everything to cold storage. The first year, started an archive the second year, and it sort of grew the staff, grew our curriculum development within IU, a lot of research projects with other people, created a screening room that's gorgeous, a little 70-person small cinema, and are overseeing the mass digitization of this film collection. So it was really sort of someone within the university realizing that it needed to be within the libraries instead of, it had been a distribution unit that sort of petered out. And literally the storage that it was in when I came on board is less than ideal. So I always like to do a big shout out, cool, dry. If you do have home movies, feel free to make sure they're not in your basement or your attic. And if they're on obsolete video formats, get them digitized. But that was kind of the short version of what we did in the last decade.
Okay, yeah. And so how large do you estimate your collection to be?
Now we're about 120,000 items. So film, video, we've really taken in audio with other collections, and a technology collection of cameras, small gauge, so 8 and 16 millimeter cameras and projectors, because we really teach the technology and how things were used, right? How people showed things and how amateur filmmaking really took off when handheld camera devices came up. So.
I'd love to touch on the topic of art in terms of, filmmaking is an art. And I'm curious, both, Jerald, you sort of touched on it. You said, I'm a documentary filmmaker, but I really arrange my films like a scripted thing. But I'm curious, both for you, Jerald, to speak to this, but also Rachael and Jordan, what do you see, like, as you're looking at these things, what's the art that you see in it? I mean, some of them were just industrial films, but still there is art in everything that's created. So I'd love to touch on that topic, both in what both of you see from the past and Jerald, what you see in the film that's created today and why it matters. Why does it matter?
That is a tough question to address filmmaking as an art form, because it's, again, I know I keep harping on this, it's a business as well, right? And so it's always that battle of commerce and financing and budgets and trying to keep some sort of creative narrative vision going. But if I can just back up to talk a little bit about what Rachael and Jordan were talking about, just the importance of archival footage and stock houses. That's gold to a documentary producer, director. And because I've done a number of historical projects, and of course you can't go back in time to film stuff. And it's really interesting to hear you guys talk, because a lot of the archival footage that I'm using might have a racial slant or might have a sexist slant. And as a filmmaker, you have to really be discriminate in how you utilize archival footage. I remember I was working on a project you mentioned, Louise, Game of Change, which was about a white basketball team, collegiate basketball team at Mississippi State that was not allowed to play against integrated teams. And they had won the SEC 2 years in a row. And then the third year, the team decided to go play in the NCAA tournament, and they literally had to sneak out of the state of Mississippi to get to East Lansing to play a game, which happened to feature a game that my father played in, right? And so we were in Starkville filming at the archives of Mississippi State. And just listening to Rachael and Jordan, a lot of images came up from where we were going through the archives, and you're just seeing some really atrocious stuff. You're just really seeing, you know, this is Deep South Mississippi in the 60s, and you're seeing images that just like, wow, you know, what do we do with this? And my videographer, one of the best in the business, a guy named Dustin Teal, who's retired now, really didn't want to film some of it. Really felt like that's just too ugly. And so, so it's a huge responsibility to not only preserve the films the right way, but also use the films in a narrative the right way. You don't want to be, and you don't want to ever exploit or be exploitational. You know, some networks kind of push you to do that. I probably shouldn't say, oh, ESPN, but some networks really can try to make you do things that you're like, all right, now you're just trying to stir it up. You're not really being truthful to the narrative here. And so that's always a battle. And so I'm really appreciating what Rachael and Jordan are talking about, because we're always going through just scores of archival footage. And not only are you looking for something that's relevant, but you also want to handle it with care, make sure it works within the narrative. Don't force it. Don't try to exploit with it or anything like that. So that was a very long segue into your answer, Louise, is that it's so subjective. I mean, Stanley Kubrick, how can you not say that's not 2001 isn't just this majestic artistic creation? But I really enjoyed, Avengers Endgame too, and so is one art, is one not? That is a hard question. I just always look for narratives that are going to really engage me, that are really going to move me. Hopefully they take me someplace, even if it's a documentary, or even if it's an industrial, even if it's commercial. It's always an experience of a journey. So in that sense, I guess in its purest form, it's definitely art. But when you're making it, you're just literally trying to survive. You're just literally trying to make sure that you get everything done with all your deadlines, make sure you're staying under budget, make sure you're being fiscally responsible. And then at the end, you just hope that you create a piece that speaks to people. So, but I'm not setting out to be like, man, I'm gonna be the next artist. I don't approach it that way. I just approach it trying to be faithful to the story, hopefully having some integrity with the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, you're incredibly honest, Jerald, because you're right. It is all of that. It's making the film there's a lot of responsibility, but it's the aesthetic that you bring to it. And in your case, you're a storyteller, right? So that's your highest calling. To jump quickly back, because I do want Rachael and Jordan's thoughts off that, and want to talk more about how you experience art in these films that you're preserving and archiving. Just access to archival footage as a filmmaker, Jerald, you referred to it, but is that, there's so much out there. I mean, we're speaking to two people whose own collections are vast, but you multiply that by many others.
You do.
Just in terms of knowing what you want to add to your film, because it is important to give context, because your other alternative is either just, it's a way of showing, right? Because you're visually showing rather than telling someone or trying to do a recreation.
Yeah, it's definitely tough, and it can make or break your narrative, of course. I mean, when I did True First, that was a docudrama series, so we did do some reenactments, but for the most part, you know, I'm celebrating historical figures that have been overlooked in history, African American figures, and there was no way we could tell these stories without still photos and archival footage. Thankfully, we had an amazing clearance lawyer who was able to implement the Fair Use Act for that particular series. So we got to use a ton of stuff, a ton of archival stuff that we would have had to pay thousands of dollars for, but fortunately we have really good sound legal counsel. And this guy's amazing. He's worked on like Tiger King, Who Killed Malcolm X, Social Dilemma, a new documentary that's on Netflix. He schooled me. You know, I've been doing this for a while, and he opened my eyes to how you can, not to shortchange Rachel or Jordan. You know, we definitely want to pay the correct licensing fees. But what you were saying, Louise, sometimes you'll find that nugget, that perfect piece of footage, and it's not. And you face two challenges. One is it at the aesthetic standards that the network wants it to be at? So can we even use it? And number two, can we afford it? And so, so it is a very tricky process, but it's one that's just so important to at least what I do as a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. So Rachel, Jordan, I would love your thoughts on, well, both what Jerald said, but also the whole idea of where do you see art in the film that you're coming across?
So I would argue, so first, let's start off thinking about the fact that a lot of your fantastic, amazing, famous filmmakers did a lot of work for hire early on in their careers, right? So, and I think that's where they learned aesthetics, or they just put aesthetics into their films, right, as they were working. I would argue that so many of the films, and I went ahead and just threw in some links of two films that I really am big fans of. One is a 1930 Encyclopedia Britannica film, and you're going to be like, Rachel, really? What are we talking about here? It's called Ocean Liners, and to me, it is like a Stieglitz photograph just come to life. It's black and white. It's just beautiful. It's all about the aesthetics of shipbuilding. But when I saw it, it was like a beautiful Stieglitz. That's all I could think about at the time, or a Weston photograph almost, right? These rich, and somebody was really thinking through it. And the other one was You Can't Eat Tobacco, which just because it was on Kodachrome, it's so beautiful and rich. And these women obviously had this incredible eye for shooting, and that's 1942. So I think that I personally just always am looking and seeing these amazing visual artists, right? And whether that is in sort of our Hollywood films that had like a lot of budgets and nice lighting, but you look at these educational films sometimes and you're like, who in the world was this person making this film? So I can get equally excited about this, or listening to Jordan talk about waterworks. I know we drove up to Gary for the mass digitization of film and picked up about 400 films that are made by the steel companies up there, which in my head are going to be the most beautiful films because they capture these beautiful industrial settings. And I know Gary, they digitized all their glass plates from a certain era from the steel mills. So I'm a very visual person, and I'm always very excited about the visuals behind it. So I pretty much can find art in all the films that I care for. So I'll let Jordan speak.
Thanks. I was thinking about the film and talking about the film registry and sort of this whole, things that are historically significant versus culturally significant versus aesthetically significant. And I very much deal in sort of like the literalist kind of historic interpretation. Just sort of advocating for more cultural things can be kind of a battle with a historic institution. So I don't really deal with a lot of like art as film. I'm gonna drop in the chat one of my favorite sort of cartoon commercials from the water company, because it is really cute and kind of has that like Schoolhouse Rock kind of vibe. But I do find little fleeting moments. Sometimes I'm very moved by a lot of the LGBTQ drag film where you're seeing these drag queens kind of like in a safe place performing, being their true authentic selves in the 1970s, 1980s, and it's very touching to see that. And then sometimes there's little glimmers in a lot of family home videos we get as part of these sort of genealogical collections, where you have these fleeting moments, usually on like family vacations, where you see kind of pastoral scenes. So those can be really beautiful, but you know, I don't think we have a lot of like, you know, practicing visual artist films in our archive.
It's sort of the accidental art that comes from, like you said, incredibly well shot films. And perhaps these were young filmmakers who went on and made a name for themselves. I just recently watched the film Bathtubs Over Broadway. I don't know if any of you have seen that. And it's the lead writer for David Letterman got really obsessed with initially the recordings of all of these incredibly highly produced events for sales meetings, for company sales meetings. And these were, you know, Broadway, you know, later to be Broadway lyricists and writers and composers writing. And then he then stumbled upon the film versions of some of these like Broadway level shows. So with you speaking to that, the subject of the film, Steve Young pursues, you know, trying to meet some of the subjects of the film or the creators of the films and the recording. So everyone has to start somewhere, right? Go ahead, Jerald.
Yeah, I was just gonna, you know, Jordan and Rich are like taking me down memory lane of projects I've kind of forgotten. And Jordan had mentioned the drag queen show, and so I had forgotten, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had started, someone approached me about doing a documentary about gay Black men in downtown Indianapolis. And so we were following some guys around, and then we ended up doing a drag show. I can't remember where or when. I think it's the early 2000s. But, you know, I guess, I don't know if I look at it as art, but I look at it as the emotion. I remember this young guy was dressed very flamboyantly, and he was dancing in a competition, and his mom was there cheering him on. And I thought it was such a beautiful moment to see that this mom had fully accepted her son, and that he was doing this very flamboyant dance, and he was just free to be himself, and she's just clapping and cheering him on. And so it's when I'm, you know, when you're storytelling, you're looking for those type of moments. Again, I don't know if I'm consciously thinking, hey, this is art, let's get it. But I'm thinking of, what's the truth here? What's the emotion here? Am I doing the subject? Am I handling it with hopefully some integrity? And so those are the things when you're telling a story, you remember those type of moments, you know, those moments that really touch you. And hopefully if it touches you while you're capturing it, it'll touch the audience when they're watching it. And maybe that is artistic expression. So I don't know, you've got my mind thinking about this art thing, and I feel like I'm trying to justify a release, but.
Well, no, I mean, every film made is interpreted through that lens of the person shooting it, right? What you chose, and then
Yes.
and then in the edit, of course, as well. But you know, what you shot, what you didn't shoot, what you included in the edit, how you reacted to something is how we as the audience are going to be presented with it. So
yeah, and I'm glad. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll say this real quick, that I do see it as a collaborative art form. I do see that. I do see that cinematographers that I've worked with just have an eye that I would never have in a million years. Editors who literally see something and a script that I've written for them, and they take it completely to a different level. Election Effect was definitely that type of experience for me, where my editor, I thought, just really crafted the narrative much smoother than I initially anticipated. And so I do see it that way. You're always looking for great artists to work with. I guess I just don't see myself as one as much, but I've had great fortune to work with some amazing videographers, editors, art directors, graphic animators, graphic designers, musicians. So it is a hodgepodge of artists. So.
Thoughts? Any further thoughts before I jump on to what I was going to talk about next? I am curious. I think what film is good at, and what it was really good at in its early years, when we as a country, because we didn't travel as much, we couldn't, see and we're such a diverse country, both geographically and culturally and socially and in every sense, and yet we are all one united country. The idea that film helped maybe someone in the South see how someone in Minnesota lived, or what the traditions of Eastern universities were to someone in California who has absolutely nothing to relate to that. Can you speak to that in terms of the film that you see, both past and present, how they have knitted us together as a culture? I mean, we're fractious, we're very divided, but we're also all Americans, and we're all here in some shape or form. And as frustrated as we can get some days, we are all still Americans. So I'd love to I'd love to hear your thoughts about how film has helped knit us together as an American society, to form that identity of all of our diverse origins, and then what makes us Americans. Little question
there. I promise I'll be quiet, because Jordan and Rachel are saying way more interesting stuff. But I had an experience this past summer with, the vicious murder of George Floyd. Was just traumatic for all of us. And someone who Rachel knows, a lady named Terry Francis, who runs the Black Film Archives down at IU, came to me and said, "Hey, can we show your documentary Facing the Facade," which was about Black student life at Indiana University, but it took place in the mid-90s. And I was embarrassed. I've always been a little bit self-conscious about it. It's so dated. I didn't have a big budget, and I begrudgingly agreed to release it back to the public. And so the response that I got, more so from my white friends who I went to grade school with, or high school with, or college with, were saying, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea the Black experience was like that. I had no idea you went through that. I had no idea that you had that type of experience." For me, that was a very American experience, because it brought together all kinds of different people to watch this particular story that happened to be from an African-American perspective, but I was so pleased that all kinds of people were able to relate to it. And so I think, Louise, that storytelling is so unifying. When I saw Schindler's List, I still think it's the greatest movie ever made, because it just opened my eyes so much better to the Holocaust. I recently showed my oldest daughter Do the Right Thing, because I think it's one of the greatest movies ever made about just the volatile nature of race relations. You can look at something like Chinatown with Robert Towne, and it's considered the greatest movie script written of all time. And even though I'm not from that era, I've never lived in California, you're transposed. And so I don't know. I think storytelling is a uniting force and does make us feel empathy for each other, and it brings hopefully understanding and so I'm a corny, patriotic guy, and I think that's just the beauty of storytelling, how it can really touch people deeply. and hopefully even bring another understanding to them as well. So.
Well, I'll be willing to pipe up also. So if we think about the history of cinema, because it was a popular art form, right? So this was something that across the country, there were movie houses everywhere. I've done historical research. Sometimes when I show an older film here, I'll go back and look where it was shown before. And just within like a little 7-block radius of the square here, there were like 8 little movie houses, right? So I think if you think about sort of across the country, this popular entertainment format that everybody was having this shared experience, whether that might not have been the most diverse experience, you're seeing Barbara Stanwyck and everybody has that experience and it is bringing people together. Obviously, I don't know, I could talk also forever about sort of the entertainment industry forever and always. And I think the film, I guess the thing about the film, talking a little bit about Star Wars, which is certainly later in life, but if you think about these sort of fan cultures across the country, specific sort of films, and you can all get together and you may have really radical differences, but because you like Star Wars or you like Xena, Princess Warrior, or whatever. Like I know some people who go to festivals just, get really, really, really specific. So I think it's this really interesting way that this mass culture has brought a lot of people together in ways that it's a dramatically different story than what you're talking about, Jerald, of our social political unrest that's about documenting imagery on what's a digital format today. But so 2 sides of the coin, entertainment and that's sort of remarkable when you think about those first films that were shown and how, people, when you read about the very first film with the train coming through and the audience ducking because they weren't ready for it to what it became later, but filling those movie houses. And I think you're right, sharing those, the Last Picture Show has come to mind because I was talking to my kids about it because my mother grew up in a ranch in West Texas and showing them that and having this concept of like, what is a dramatically different world, right? I think there's some weird ways we have shared experiences because of cinema.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of building off that, talking about empathy when we're thinking about historic and archival footage more so than like Hollywood film. It's so weird for me to say because like I'm a building historian. I don't do people history because people love to building. But when you watch like historic archival footage of, tragic events of things like strikes and floods and, downtown building fires, and you see the people watching and the look on their face, like you can connect with people from a century ago. And like, I think that means something. And I think it touches people in a way that you can't glean that from a Civil War diary or from a historic photo. I think there's something magical about being able to see your expression, see someone's face kind of change and see their body language, and you understand like we're all connected about our collective heritage.
Yeah, well said. With these last few minutes, I have 2 things I wanted to cover, and one is just a very, very functional thing that sort of came up when we were, the panel and I were chatting last week, and that is just the nuts and bolts of, actually, okay, just to back up, I first saw this film at Sundance in 2011 when it came out, and one of the things that the filmmaker was quick to stress was, you young filmmakers, do not think that just because you have this on your hard drive that this thing is safe. Formats get old and go in, do something, preserve your images and make sure that in 10 years, in 20 years, they're still accessible. So just to kind of get into the nuts and bolts, both for people in their home videos and such, but also for professional filmmakers. Can you guys speak a bit to how we can preserve, like you just said, there was just, billions of bytes of data probably recorded just in this election week, and how's it going to be preserved? Can you two sort of school us on what we should all be doing to make sure it doesn't get lost and locked in a digital box?
We're just lost.
You just lost, yeah. Yeah.
Well, first, let me just remind everyone who was speaking last week that Jordan volunteered to teach all the filmmakers on the planet, step by step. No, I would start off by saying that even motion picture or video comes in such a mess because, and I'm sure Jerald knows, like the production happens, it's over, if the film is done, and y'all just throw it in a box usually. I've had some, we have a couple collections here at the Lilly Library of sort of very famous filmmakers, and those collections came in such a mess. So it takes time to organize. But what's scary, and I think what you're alluding to, so over the last 50 years, video formats, equipment has become obsolete. We can't actually even access this. Magnetic media is very fragile. And what we're about to lead into is all of the digital information that is going to be gone in the next 5, 10, 20 years, I think. Some basic tips, metadata, always label, right? As much cataloging as you can over and over again, so that in 40, 50 years, if we can even access it, people aren't like, what the heck is this? If we're talking about digital formats, you would need to look at multiple locations for storage, right? So, and thinking about even cloud servers, not just like you have it on your hard drive on your desk, because lots of ways that can go badly. So multiple storage, but also thinking about reformatting those digital files, right? So in 20 years, whatever format you might have put it on may not actually exist anymore. So making sure that your files are up to date. And Jordan, if you want to pop in, since I think you raised this last week, but I train people to deal with old stuff. I bet we talk all the time here that in the media school, we need to be talking to these filmmakers doing this today, and perhaps even to Jerald, because you're nodding.
I think Jerald had kittens when he realized that maybe his Dropbox was not the best place to keep everything.
And then back to metadata, I always use this metaphor when I'm dealing with contemporary videographers in the archive, but I think I can say this because we have at least 3 musicians still in the attendees. I see Evan, I see Kyle, I see Matt. So when you guys are like cutting an album and you're like writing a song, you'll have like final version 1, and then all of a sudden, oh whoops, we forgot, we like didn't mix it right. Final version 2, and oh whoops, not enough tambourine. Final version 3, and then all of a sudden you just like have all of these labels for these files that don't mean anything anymore. So like being intentional and consistent in how you name files, so that when the archivist gets your amazing music archive, when you guys die, it's easier for them to know what the sort of process was and the order of things. So it's being consistent, but then documenting your process. So like why are there different versions, and what is the final cut? So I always compare it to recording an album, because I think that's easier for people to think about how they create their filing system, how they describe each file, and then sort of the metadata or the labeling system for how you're explaining your documentation, like what's your logic. If you have that, that will help a future archivist so much. So really just being consistent, and yeah, second, the backing up everything. If you can put it in 2 or 3 different locations, some remote hard drive in Africa, like you should do it. If you sort of definitely support that, because think about what happened when MySpace went down, and all the weird bands we listened to in the early 2000s that there's no digital files and there's no, we like lost a whole era of music for a second there.
Well put, well put. So I have a final question that I'd love each one of you to answer. And that is, what gives you joy in your work? I'm curious to know. You can take that any way you want.
When it's done. It's the best word in production, it's done. I mean, I love the whole process, but finishing it, then that's for me is the journey's complete. Well, it's never really complete. At some point, you just gotta say it's over. But that's always a sense of accomplishment that you and your crew and the people involved share. So that's the most joyous part of it. I don't really like the screenings part of it when it's distributed, just like when it's done. So
is it hard to say, to know when it's done, or is it just, you just have to, as some people say, you don't finish a film and you abandon it. You just
do.
have to say, like,
Totally.
okay, I could keep tweaking this for the next 10 years.
You totally do. I remember this, you guys will make fun of me for this one. Documentaries can be fun, and it doesn't always have to be serious social commentary. And I did a documentary in the mid-90s on Damon Bailey, the basketball phenomenon. And I remember literally the editor was like, dude, it's done, you know, and I was getting a little bit clamped because I had worked on it for, I don't know, maybe about 8 months. And I was like, oh man, you know, it's really truly finished. I gotta let it go. I gotta let it go to be broadcast. So sometimes I get emotional about them, but sometimes, you know, it's just such a huge relief just to be finished, because as you know, Louise, filmmaking is just such an excruciating, draining experience, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So being done, it's my joy.
That's good.
I'm a helper. I like to take care of it. And I always tell my big joke with my profession is, I'm not a hoarder, I'm an archivist. I like to meet people and think the stuff is safe with me. Like, I and take good care of it. And I connect with a lot of people who are like cleaning out their parents' estate, or you know, children of movers and shakers, and you know, literal builders of the city. I had the son of a pretty important structural engineer who worked with a lot of contractors and did really cool buildings in the 20th century throughout the city. And just like having him give me the stuff and being like, I'm gonna like value your dad's stuff, and like we're gonna like turn this is gonna be his legacy, and then other people can appreciate, you know, what he did to literally build the city. So for me, there's an emotional component.
And Rachel.
I love my job. I will say I feel very fortunate, and I feel fortunate how supported I've been. I love sharing what we've created. So I think a lot of it, a little bit like Jordan, is about connecting with other people, whether it's the students who, when I've taught classes, but I also have a lot of students that I sort of baby bird in the archive, and when they realize it's a whole profession, and then they get so excited, and then they land jobs. But I also find lately I've decided I'm just here to like make 80 and 90-year-olds really happy. Like all the educational filmmakers whose collections we're preserving and digitizing, or people who were in some of these films. So I think, like Jordan, I get actually a lot of, because you know, you can sit there and catalog films, or you can digitize films and put exhibits up, but it's when other people get really, really excited and emotional. I mentioned in the chat Home Movie Day, which we do every year, and we invite members of the public to come in and we inspect their stuff and we show them. We've had tears. So a woman whose parents' wedding film, which she'd never seen, and her parents had passed away. You know, she was in her 50s or 60s. It's just sobbing. Like, people, the emotions I think connected with history and memory and visual imagery is so strong, right? And these are our memories. So I think there's a lot of value, at least for me, of just being super, super excited about the work that I do.
Yeah. A question just came in that I want to make sure that we answer. And I thank you, all of you, for attending to the chat. You all have very nicely, all on your own, answered some of the questions. But Joan asked if there's an archive in Indiana that will digitize and archive home movies and let the owners keep the original films or videos.
That's a good question. Usually we take in the material because I can't pay for to digitize other people's stuff. But I know there's a model like in Texas that does this. maybe if you email the archive, I can look into it. I don't know if Jordan has any thoughts there.
We do a little bit of what we call loan for digitization, which is when we just make a digital copy and give back the archival material, but it has to be, we really have to justify it for moving image workload, because that's so much more significant than just scanning images. So I'm going to second what Evan said in the chat, Joan. I think you just created Indiana Album 2.0 for yourself.
I know my, just our own family archive of moving images, Costco did a pretty decent job. I don't know how far back they go in terms of format, but I know that sounds kind of funny compared to, you know, the higher level work that you guys do, but I have been able to see some films that they were in formats that we don't have the player for. We're pretty old, back to, you know, the 50s and 60s at least. So that's the limit of my knowledge. So I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank our audience for attending tonight. I know that watching a screen in the evening is probably not how we all want to be doing it, but that's our life in 2020. If you have not seen it, I do urge you to watch the film These Amazing Shadows. It's available for free on Canopy with a K, just like Can. It's free with your library card. And it's an amazing service. It's a streaming platform just like Netflix or Hulu or any of the others, but it is completely free through your library. The film is also available for rent, and I would say for this film or anything other, I really recommend the website of the app, justwatch.com, as the place to go. Just type in the title of whatever film you're thinking about, where is it, and it'll tell you where you can stream it or rent it or whatever. So just a little pro tip there. I encourage you to check out the rest of the Spirit in Place lineup through the rest of the festival. It got going late last week, and there's lots more to come. So I encourage you to go to the Spirit in Place website and check out the film, the lineup, the film. Here I am, the lineup of all the other programs. As Erin mentioned in the opening video, please do share your thoughts with Spirit in Place. And fill out their online survey. We'll put it in the chat right now. Also, I wanted to say that I am going to send out to all of our attendees an email that will have all of these links and things. And I try to take notes on sort of the tips on what to do to better preserve your data, your moving image data. So I'll put all that in an email that I'll send to you tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'm deeply grateful to all of you. The survey just went in the chat. So if you could do that for Spirit in Place and help us improve the work we do, plus help the whole festival know better what to do. The festival is a great, wonderful cultural icon in our community. And the best thing is they're always trying to do better. So we're grateful to be a part of it. And thank you everyone for adapting to the reality of 2020. Jordan, Ryan, Rachael Stoeltje, and Jerald Harkness, thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart. It's been an enjoyable time for me. And I hope that the next time we do this, we'll do this in person at the Can Theater. If you want to check out what we're doing at the Can, just go to cancanindy.com, or you can join our newsletter. You can subscribe to our newsletter, the weekly, which comes out every Thursday, or obviously follow us on social media. And of course, we're Can with a K, not the French dancing one. So thank you so much, all of you, and to everyone who joined us this evening. Have a great evening and enjoy taking in lots and lots of Spirit in Place events the rest of the week. Good night and thank you. Bye-bye.